This is Newstalk ZB News.
Good morning, it's 6:30. I'm Niva Manu. Fears New Zealand's military involvement in the fight against Houthi rebels in Yemen could close diplomatic doors. 6 personnel are being deployed to the Red Sea to support coalition forces carrying out precision attacks on Iran-backed groups who've been attacking commercial shipping. Geopolitical analyst Jeffrey Miller says several US presidents have bombed Yemen and haven't solved the problem. He told Roman Travers the Houthi attacks are tied to the war in Gaza and that should be our focus.
And I would argue that New Zealand could be better served by really getting involved in the de-escalation dialogue diplomacy space to try and get that ceasefire in Gaza.
Prime Minister Christopher Luxon says the two issues shouldn't be conflated. Speaking of which, the Israeli army says 24 of its soldiers have been killed in Gaza, the deadliest day for its forces since their ground operation began. That includes 21 reservists who died in an explosion. The Israeli military says it was probably caused by mines their own forces had placed in 2 buildings to demolish them.
This is Newstalk ZB News.
Good morning, it's 7:30. I'm Niva Manu. The Defence Minister says New Zealand has taken a principled stand against Houthi attacks on commercial shipping in the Middle East. New Zealand will send 6 personnel to the Red Sea as part of an ongoing US-led mission to strike the Iran-backed rebels carrying out the attacks from Yemen. Judith Collins told Tim Dower the war and the attacks should not be conflated as the attacks were going on long before the war in Gaza.
The Houthis have seized upon what's happening, the war between Hamas and Israel, as being a reason that they could ramp up their attacks.
And there's a view the decision to send the 6 could be part of a longer-term tilt towards US alignment. But geopolitical analyst Jeffrey Miller says we should be focusing on diplomacy instead. He says we'll likely send more personnel and could even be joining military alliances.
This decision on AUKUS is really pending, whether we join AUKUS Pillar 2. Judith Collins and Winston Peters have both been very sympathetic to the US calls on that.
ZB.
The government has announced New Zealand is sending 6 defence personnel to the Red Sea to carry out precision attacks on Houthi rebels. The Defence Minister Judith Collins says it's in response to international efforts to stop the militant group from targeting commercial shipping and causing heavy trade disruption, as we're seeing that going on at the moment. We will be speaking in just a few minutes with Jeffrey Miller, who's an international geopolitical analyst on this. And, yeah, it's such a key issue for us and for the world as well. Very good morning to you, Jeffrey. Thank you for joining us here this morning.
Good morning, Roman.
So you're all over this. What's your take on it in a broad sense?
It's a huge shift. It's a huge shift for New Zealand foreign policy. We are going to be supporting these US-led airstrikes on Yemen against Houthi targets. It's all slightly confusing because there's also Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is a much bigger maritime patrol operation that the US announced last month. And initially I thought, well, that's what New Zealand's being involved in. That involves over 20 countries. But no, it actually seems that this is supporting these airstrikes. And it's a much smaller group of countries. Only around 10 were on the joint statement that was issued on the 11th of January. And really it's the US and UK supported mainly by Bahrain, by Canada, the Netherlands and Australia. So it's a very small group of countries, half a dozen countries. And many countries are staying well away from this because they see that it's more important to focus on getting a ceasefire in Gaza, and that is the root cause of all the instability that we're seeing in the Red Sea.
Right. Thanks, Jeffrey. Now, Prime Minister Christopher Luxon says that nearly 15% of global trade flows through the Red Sea. Have a listen to this.
They're driving costs higher for Kiwis and causing delays to shipments that now have to round the Cape of Good Hope. More than 2,000 ships have been diverted from the Red Sea.
So just based on that, the fact that we are a trading country, we should be getting involved. Was our involvement expected at some point?
Look, there's no doubt about the problem here, that it is a huge problem for global trade, for shipping going through the Red Sea into the Suez Canal, and it does affect New Zealand. I guess the question is whether our response in terms of this military response is really going to be useful. You've had successive US administrations now conducting bombing on Yemen, and it hasn't really solved anything. Yes, in the short term, you'll degrade the Houthi infrastructure that is launching missiles and attacks against the ships. But you're not going to solve the long-term issues. I mean, Yemen has been in a civil war since 2015, and you've got hundreds of thousands have been killed, millions who are subject to famine. I would argue that's the root cause of what we're seeing. That's an unresolved conflict there, and also the war in Gaza. And the Houthis have openly said that this is their response, their solidarity with Palestinians as long as this war continues. And I would argue that New Zealand could be better served by really getting involved in the de-escalation dialogue diplomacy space to try and get that ceasefire in Gaza. And instead we're supporting the US, which is, remember, blocking attempts for a ceasefire in Gaza and has been very much supportive of Israel in its response to, of course, those brutal attacks by Hamas on October the 7th.
Is this reaction largely down to requests from our allies, the big boys like the US?
Yes. Look, the new Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, and Judith Collins, the Defence Minister, have been very clear that they want to align New Zealand more closely with the United States and with Australia. Now, look, most of the talk in that direction has been about AUKUS in the Indo-Pacific and what we're doing here. But, of course, there's a global element to this as well. And we have been called in and we've been asked to make a contribution. It's a small contribution, more of a token one. 6 personnel is probably not going to make a huge amount of difference in practical terms in relation to intelligence gathering, but it's hugely symbolic to have New Zealand now on the list of countries involved in these airstrikes on Yemen. It's the hard end, it's the very hawkish end of the US response to events in the Middle East at the moment. And it really is quite a shake-up to New Zealand foreign policy.
OK, so what's the end game here for New Zealand? We'll just curtail and do whatever the US and Britain want. Is that basically it?
Well, I think it is within the end of the wedge here. I think we will send further troops. 6 will probably be the starting point, and we will send further troops down the line. We may get involved elsewhere. I mean, this decision on AUKUS is really pending, whether we join AUKUS Pillar 2. Judith Collins and Winston Peters have both been very sympathetic to the US calls on that. So we'll probably be joining AUKUS in some form. And it perhaps does close the door towards New Zealand playing this mediation role, using what we call our independent foreign policy, our voice in events in the Middle East. I've just spent several months in the Gulf as part of my research, and I think most New Zealanders are not aware of just the high level of credibility New Zealand has in the Middle East. As we're seen as an honest broker and a country that is able to talk to all sides. And by getting involved in these airstrikes and this military response, we are perhaps closing the door to options that we could use our voice in terms of getting this, getting a ceasefire, getting a sustainable 2-state political solution in Gaza. Ultimately, what we're seeing here with this US response, these airstrikes, they are a military solution to a political problem. And I think in the end, that's perhaps one of the biggest problems we've got with our approach to the Middle East.
All right, thank you. Jeffrey Miller, an international geopolitical analyst, thank you very much for your thoughts this morning.